everybody to The Art of Science TV, where we will convert, converse and connect with all of you and with the art of science. We have our special, wonderful, amazing panelist today, Dr. Simon Tucker. Simon is a serial entrepreneur scientist who believes in turning innovations and products that can help improve people's lives. Simon, thank you for joining us at this new time, very early time, of 8:30 on a Wednesday morning. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
So let's get straight into it. Climate change seems to be having some obvious effect on weather patterns, poses a real risk to our well-being through, for example, the wildfires, food supplies, but recent research has suggested an impact on infectious diseases and their prevalence that may have even more profound effects. Is the connection real? What can you tell us about it?
Well, at first you might think this is kind of an odd connection, but let's unpack it a bit and have a little bit of a think about it. So weather patterns have an impact on human behavior. So for instance, when it's cold and wet, we tend to crowd together. And they also have an impact on animals and insects and so forth that are vectors of disease. So that sounds like it's likely that weather could have an impact on disease. And we've known for quite a considerable number of years that there are correlations between infectious diseases and weather. So for example, if we take a very common example, the common cold and influenza strikes us in the colder months. It tends to be the winter, for instance. And the reason for that largely is that we tend to gather indoors and we're close to each other, and proximity promotes transmission. There's also issues around humidity and things like that that might preserve the virus as well, but it's principally contact, human to human contact, which is driving that. So that's a good example of how weather affects disease transmission. But then it gets a little bit more complicated. So for example, there's a correlation between weather and influenza pandemics. So the last 4 influenza pandemics, which were the big one, 1918, 1957, 1968, and 2009, all occurred in warmer months when they shouldn't have. They started in the warmer months. That's odd. And they correlated by La Nina conditions. And at first you think, well, my goodness, that doesn't make any sense. But La Nina conditions change the migratory behavior of birds, and birds transmit the disease. And so it changes the way birds contact other animals, changes the way those diseases can be transmitted to those other animals and ultimately humans. But there's a recent publication out of the University of Hawaii, a delightful place, by the way, which did a much more comprehensive analysis. And what they've done is they've done what is essentially a Google search to link climate change with disease outbreaks. And so they used a number of different keywords, 10 actually, associated with climate change, things like drought, rainfall, stuff like that, the kind of things you would expect, with various disease keywords. And they found a really very striking correlation and concluded that over half of the infectious diseases of humankind are linked to climatic conditions and climate change. That's really striking. In fact, they concluded that 58% of all infectious diseases that have impacted humanity in recorded history are related to climate change in some way. So why is that? The very simple conclusion that the authors draw from this relatively complex analysis is it means that climate change is bringing humans together and together with disease. So that could be bringing humans close together or bringing humans in close contact with disease vectors like mosquitoes and things like that. And also changing the way that those vectors are distributed. So, for example, as the climate warms, and we get wetter conditions in some areas, the mosquitoes spread. And you get diseases that are associated with mosquitoes like dengue in areas that previously had never seen those diseases. But you also have situations where land use changes cause people to move into new areas, and also interact with animals they might not previously have interacted with to such a significant extent. And that's probably where COVID came from. So, you know, this is real. It's actually happening. We've seen it in the past, and we're seeing it now, and we're probably going to see it in the future. Just to give you a few examples of diseases that are known to be affected by climate change, and this is by no means a comprehensive list. HIV, Zika, which is a nasty little infection, malaria, dengue, chikungunya, influenza, Ebola, MERS, SARS, in all its forms. So all of those diseases, just those I've listed, cause millions of deaths. So climate conditions that promote their spread are not a great idea. You can put it into economic terms if you want to. I mean, COVID is supposedly caused the US alone $16 trillion worth of cost. But the economic impact obviously impacts people as well. So the economic impact to a country is actually translated into economic deprivation to a lot of people within the country. So it's not something to be trivialized. In total, this study found that 277 pathogens or pathogenic diseases were found to be aggravated by climate change. 277, with over 1,000 different pathways for this change to occur, which is very troubling indeed. And I'll just quote the lead author of the study, Camilo Mora, who's clearly got some surfing in his background. He said, as this database started to grow, I started to get scared, man. And as he realized the magnitude, he said, I went from excited, obviously excited by the science, to terrified. And concluded that unless climate change is addressed, there is no way with so many diseases and so many different pathways that we humans can fully adapt. Terribly sobering thing to start the discussion with, but basically it says unless we do something about climate change, we're going to see more and more infectious diseases impacting us in more and more different ways. So COVID is perhaps just the first.
I think it is very sobering. It isn't the most optimistic news to start the day with, but it also means that we can take action as we go through our day. We can take little actions that lead to bigger actions and bigger ripple effects. And if we all do our part, I think that's what we need to take away. They're very sobering, very heavy diseases also that you mentioned. So thank you for shedding some light on that. And also let's be armed and dangerous in the way that we can go out there and make a difference. So thank you. We'll move away from the climate change picture at the moment. South Korea has just launched a moon probe. What more is it likely to learn than we already know? And what are the implications of new countries entering the space race now?
This is wonderful. I'm a bit of a space geek. I can't help it. So I'm not sure I'd call it a space race because, you know, we were up or at least the US had landed people on the moon in the late 60s and early 70s, and then nothing much happened after that. But things are really starting to hot up. So this is South Korea entering the space exploration program. They've launched a probe that it's not going to land on the moon. It's going to circle the moon for about a year in orbit, but interestingly, very close orbit, around about 100 kilometers. And it's got a gamma ray detector on board that's very, very sensitive. So what it's going to do is measure the trace minerals and other things on the surface of the moon things like titanium, iron, and so forth. But also, interestingly, look for water. The early studies suggested there is some water on the moon, possibly on the poles. And obviously the implications for this are associated with future manned missions and potentially colonization in the long term. So I think this is actually really quite exciting. Just as an aside, the probe was launched from Cape Canaveral on a SpaceX rocket. So a nice alignment of a government from South Korea, the US, and a commercial organization sending a probe up there to do some basic research, which I kind of liked. It's called Danuri, which is an agglomeration of two words in the South Korean language that means basically enjoy the moon, or moon enjoyment. It's going to join quite an interesting line of spacecraft going up there. So India is about to launch a lander and rover to the moon, which is pretty impressive. NASA is going to launch an Artemis program, what they call the Artemis program, which starts with uncrewed flights, but is intended to eventually lead to manned missions in 2025. And a bit of a sleeper here that perhaps people hadn't realized, China is very prevalent in the moon race. It started conducting operations in 2007. It's done 2 rover missions, in other words, landing a robot on the moon and the robot moving around. That was in 2013 and 2019. And very impressively did a return sample mission robotically in 2020, which returned over a ton, about 1.7 tons, I think it was, of materials from the moon. That's pretty capable. To be able to do that is a very high capability. And China said that it intends to launch a manned mission, and that it has an objective to build a scientific research station on the moon, on the South Pole. So in the next 10 years, which is pretty ambitious and pretty impressive. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of movement in space exploration in the next decade. I suspect as well space exploitation, which is somewhat of a concern, but not necessarily if it's done for the benefit of mankind. But anyway, there's going to be a lot more players in the game, so it's exciting times ahead.
It is very interesting as well with the whole space exploration. 1.7 tons absolutely rocks me, no pun intended, because of the physics involved. Because I know everything's so carefully measured, trajectories are measured, gravitational pulls measured, when they have to let go certain parts of the capsules, etc. That's one thing, calculating it on the way up, but then calculating how to increase the weight and bring all these samples back is, for me, who's a non-mathematician, non-physician, quite a remarkable feat. They must spend hours on these formulas, Simon.
Oh, they do. Yeah, and like I say, it's a really impressive feat of physics and engineering.
And also, I think that the fact that they have already 3D printed, you know, the first ever tool was 3D printed in space, not the first ever tool that went to space, but there was a tool, a wrench that was 3D printed in space, and the concept that they can actually print a large amount of the space stations that they're looking to take up there, the absolute the parameters of what is a possibility, they're quite immense. Oh,
tremendously. I mean, if you look at 3D printing, which is basically taking the manufacturing base with you, the potential is tremendous. I mean, Monash University, for instance, has 3D printed a working jet engine.
I've seen it. I've actually seen it, and it was a few years ago now, and I saw this huge, it was gold, huge gold structure, and they said that's actually the launch, the rocket part of this of something that's going into space that could actually, what got me then was it could withstand the heat.
No, I know.
here's this 3D printed thing. And, you know, we're used to printing paper and things like that. And I've eaten a 3D printed chocolate, and that was quite nice. I'm very happy that I don't have one of those machines in my house. But it's when you look at it, it's quite phenomenal. The weight and the fact that it can bear all this extreme heat is quite remarkable. There's so many advances that you know are not part of our everyday knowledge. So yeah, thank you for sharing a lot of the information that you do with us, and not part of our everyday knowledge, leading into a amazing human that you have only just introduced me to. And it's been a big week of loss, particularly my background is music. So Judith Durham, Olivia Newton-John passing very recently. But Jim Lovelock, who is an amazing human. Thank you for introducing me to him this morning. And passed at the age of 102. Can you share some of his achievements? Because they are amazingly remarkable.
He was a remarkable man, he was born in 1919, which kind of puts this into perspective. And by the way, I share your thoughts with respect to musicians. I've enjoyed their music for a very long time. He was almost a self-taught scientist. So he started out life in a relatively impoverished family. His father, for instance, was illiterate until he was older and taught himself to read, and became a scientist of tremendous renown that nobody knows about. So he's the author of the Gaia hypothesis, the hypothesis that the Earth is, in essence, a living organism that self-regulates. And I don't think anyone argues anymore that the Earth is a self-regulating system. Whether it's an organism is a different matter. But, he did some remarkable things throughout his life. He started off working in a photography company because he couldn't fund himself to go to higher school or go to university. Eventually won a scholarship to attend Manchester University and attended and did a chemistry degree, and eventually got a medical degree. But what I love about him, apart from that, is he was a self-funded inventor. He set himself up as an inventor. He invented some remarkable things. He did some of the early work on cryopreservation of animals, in which he was involved in figuring out humane ways of thawing, and this sounds awful, frozen hamsters and mice. And by doing so, probably was involved in inventing the microwave, which he always thought was rather amusing, which a very somewhat British approach, I think. He invented a detector that was able to detect CFCs and DDT. That was so sensitive, he claimed that you could spill some CFCs in the UK and, you know, like a little bottle, and detect them in Japan a week later. And that was instrumental in identifying the prevalence of CFCs in our atmosphere and DDT in our environment, which led to all of the changes that we then created around the release of CFCs. And he became a prominent climate proponent. In fact, he advised Margaret Thatcher's government around climate change. He advised NASA, was involved in multiple NASA programs. It kind of goes on. It's very hard to sort of list all his achievements. He was always a delightfully pleasant person to be interviewed and was willing to be interviewed. Led a relatively quiet life, and did a lot of his inventions in what he called a barn, which wasn't a barn, on the Cornwall-Devon border, which is the area I grew up in. So it's there's a number of correlations here, and I just think there's this gentleman needs to be lauded more than he was.
Simon, there's many people like that in science. So we appreciate Einstein, Madame Curie, you know, so many others that are well known. But this gentleman that has been living here, and I'm hearing his name, you know, I'm not totally ignorant to science. I read a lot of science newsletters, etc. But I'm by no means an expert, so I don't want to imply that I should know about him. But why do people like this fall under the radar, and what is it that we can actually do to help raise the profile of some of these remarkable people doing incredible things for the progress of Earth?
I think we just need to talk about them, be aware about them, and talk about them. I mean, he actually, when he was studying the atmosphere of Mars with NASA, he, together with one of the greatest biologists of all time, Lynn Margulis, published a paper in which they said, well, hang on a minute, Mars has got an atmospheric composition which is inconsistent with life. Not inconsistent with life occurring, but inconsistent with life being present. In other words, there was far too much carbon dioxide. The atmosphere was nothing like Earth's, which is a complex atmosphere created by life. So he created this hypothesis that life would be associated with atmospheric conditions that had a particular signature. NASA still uses that as a test for life on other planets. It's called the Lovelock Test. They named it after him. Now, so there's an awful lot of people out there in science that know a hell of a lot about this guy. But for those people that like a little bit of science fiction, he was involved in advising the BBC about sound systems and so forth, and probably was involved in the theme tune of Doctor Who, which to me that tickles me something chronic. I find that tremendously amusing. But yeah, it was a real what should we say, a 20th century or 21st century inventor, both centuries actually, and a bit of a mover and shaker, but we just don't know them.
And without wanting to make light of anything that he's done, when you said he worked out of a barn, I'm thinking, don't most innovators and inventors start working out of a shed? Because just out of that sheer determination, they'll work out of anywhere. Look, Simon, thank you for sharing part of him with us. I'd love to actually make this a regular part of the show, even if we could mention somebody brilliant that, you know, that we don't necessarily know about. And before we go today, can you share a piece of wisdom with our audience? Not that you haven't shared many already.
I'm gonna take a quote of Jim's actually. So he's made many comments with respect to climate change and so forth in humanity, but he said, keep in mind that it is hubris to think that we know how to save the Earth. Our planet looks after itself. All we can do is try to save ourselves.
Oh, that just sent chills up me, because it just rings so true. So my challenge to everybody today is to take that information, do something for the planet today, no matter how small, no matter how irrelevant you may think it will be, or no matter how little of a difference it will make. Because if 7 billion people, nearly 8 billion people around the planet, do one small thing, that's an incredible way for us to show respect to Mother Earth. And also the second challenge is go and find out about a scientist that you have not heard about. So, and we'll ask Simon to potentially bring a story to us every week. Simon, thank you for joining us today at this new time, at this new early time of 8:30 on a Wednesday morning. If you enjoyed the program, please share it with your friends, colleagues, families. And if there's anything that you would like us in particular to discuss, please send it in on the chat below. Have a wonderful day. Simon, thanks again. Hayley, thank you in the background. Have a good day, everybody.